Welcome, everyone. It is really, really wonderful that you could be here with us today for this global premiere of Infinite Potential. Thousands of you are with us at this very moment from all over the world. And it's just amazing to consider that at this very time, we're all together in this virtual space. I'm Susan Bauer-Wu, and I'm the president of the Mind and Life Institute. And Mind and Life is honored to be partnering with the Fetzer Memorial Trust in this global premiere. So we're going to have a panel discussion, and we're expecting this to be a really rich discussion. And we invite you to participate. So please share comments and questions in the comment box, and we will pass them on to the panelists. So I'm pleased to introduce the panelists. We have three really wonderful, esteemed people to join us. Paul Howard is the director and producer of Infinite Potential, and Paul's worked across most film and television industry disciplines, and Paul's genres include biography, natural history, wildlife, and current affairs. And we also have Jan Walleczek, and Jan was a film interviewee. He lives in Berlin, Germany, where he founded Phenoscience Laboratories. Jan's research interests are diverse, and his scientific publications cover fields including biology, chemistry, engineering, and physics. And we also have Professor Basil Hiley, who is also a film interviewee. Basil is a British quantum physicist and professor emeritus at the University of London, and he is a longtime collaborator and friend of David Bohm. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here with this panel. And I'll ask the first question to Jan. So Jan, what do you think is the single most important contribution of David Bohm related to philosophy and science?
Well, especially after watching the movie, I'm reminded again about what fascinated me about David Bohm all these years. And so I'm really pleased that we were able to do this movie, that we've met up with Paul Howard, and that the movie came out so well. And I think the biggest, what will remain of David Bohm, for a long time in the future, looking even 100 years back, I think that he will be recognized as the leading pioneer on the thinking of wholeness in science. And remember what that means. Wholeness is a very loaded word. I think it was mentioned so many times in the movie in all different contexts, and ranging from spirituality in philosophy, but also in science. And I think what David Bohm did, he took this concept of wholeness and gave it a scientific grounding in a new way based on quantum physics. And very early on, he saw the potential, based on the insights in quantum theory, this potential of quantum theory for explaining the holistic nature of the universe, including consciousness, how to overcome the subject-object divide, thereby addressing the mind-matter problem, all the way to how to even unify relativity theory with quantum theory. All of these ideas of his are grounded in the fundamental notion of wholeness. And so he was a true pioneer of holistic thinking. What we forget today is that when you look the last 30 years, there have been so many books on holism, holistic thinking, holistic philosophy. But David Bohm really initiated this a long time ago in his thinking in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And when with the New Age spiritual movement, wholeness became such a household word, he not only engaged wholeness as a spiritual concept, but he was on a path to find wholeness in science. And I think we are not there yet. Science today is really, for the most part, reductionistic, materialistic, and it's very powerful at that. But maybe a future science might be a science that is grounded in a new form of relationality, of integration, or of wholeness as David Bohm would say. And of course, his famous books, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, pioneered this concept. But also, and that's why I'm so pleased to have Basil Hiley here join us on the panel. He wrote this very influential book, co-authored with Basil Hiley, called The Undivided Universe, and which really caught my attention and inspired my way of thinking on wholeness. And so I'm eternally grateful to David Bohm for initiating these ideas, and they will resonate across decades, if not centuries, perhaps. So I think this will be his most lasting legacy. It's to set science on a path towards wholeness. I think with this I end for now.
Thank you, Jan. My next question is for Professor Hiley. So, Basil, you have been or were a longtime friend and collaborator of David's, and so we'd love to hear how you met him and how you started working with him.
Yes, okay, you're taking me back a long way. I was just finishing my PhD under Cyril Dom at King's College, and I was looking around as to what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And there was a meeting scheduled in Cumberland Lodge in Great Windsor Park here in London. And there was a guy billed to speak. This guy was David Bohm. And I'm afraid I'd never heard of him at that stage. But he was interested in quantum theory. And one of the things I went to university to actually study physics was quantum mechanics. I was puzzled by it even when I was at school. And I asked questions in my undergraduate class, and everybody sort of shook their heads and said, no, get on and learn this stuff first. That's for the future. So I had none of these questions answered. My PhD was in solid state physics, no quantum mechanics there. So I thought, oh, well, there's this guy, David Bohm. Let me just sit at the back of the room and see what he has to say. Wow. I was actually blown away. Not only was he asking the same questions that I was asking, but he was actually providing answers, not the answers from the textbooks in those days, but answers that really fascinated me. And I said, this is the guy I want to work with if possible. Now, fortunately, he had just been given a chair in theoretical physics, a newly created chair at Berkeley College. And there was an assistant lectureship job going. So I thought, okay, let's have a try. And for some reason, they actually allowed me into the college and appointed me as an assistant lecturer. And in fact, that's where my intellectual journey began, and what a journey it was. When I joined, there was a small group of people interested in trying to bring relativity and general relativity and quantum mechanics together, as you've been hearing in the film. But remember, this was the 1960s. It was right at the beginning. We have now moved on a tremendous amount. And I thought I'd like to give you some idea of what it was like working with David in those days. I say we had a small group. Who would be in the group? It was David Bohm, of course, and there was Roger Penrose himself. And we were interested in some revolutionary ideas, pre-space. Can we somehow start with something more primitive and develop not only space-time, but also material, matter from this process? Well, where do we start? Well, fortunately, there was Roger Penrose there. He was developing his spin networks and his twistor theory way ahead of the time. David Bohm was not talking about hidden variables. He was talking about structure process. What is the underlying structure that will give rise to classical physics? In that particular approach, of course, Bohm had taken what Niels Bohr was suggesting, that somehow quantum mechanics was introducing a new notion of wholeness. But Bohr would not go any further than saying, oh, we've reached the limits of our of our knowledge, and he introduced the idea of the principle of complementarity. So that stopped effectively all investigations into any deeper processes that might be underlying quantum mechanics. So what we've got to try and do here, said Bohm, we've got to try and bring together this deeper process and somehow talk about its structure, but structure is abstract. Where do we get that structure from? Where do we get ideas from that structure? We couldn't get it from physics itself because physics was following the reductionist language, the reductionist point of view. So I found myself looking structure. Where can we get structure? What about the artists? They're talking very much about structure. So I found myself, can you imagine it? Some newly appointed lecturer in physics going and spending time in the Tate Gallery in London, looking at artists, how they capture structure. David Bohm was saying one of the most important things was movement. Somehow we begin with this structure, this process. This process is all about movement. And you heard about the stepping stones in the film. How do we capture movement? Again, you go to the artists, you try and see how they capture movement. We've all got mobile cameras. Take a snapshot of a waterfall and it looks static and stationary. You go to an artist, you look at him and you say, oh my God, that water is actually flowing in that waterfall. Now, how can we do that in the mathematics? That was one of the ideas that we were trying to explore. Then there was looking at philosophy. Maybe the philosophers can help us form new concepts in which we can actually understand this notion of wholeness in a much clearer way than the vague way that Niels Bohr had introduced it. So we went to Kant, we went to Schelling, Fichte, we went to Hegel. As you heard, Hegel was Bohm found Hegel very enlightening and had spent a lot of time reading him. To be quite blunt with you, I do not get on with Hegel at all, so don't worry. Then what else can we do? Then we went, oh, well, as we were trying to form these concepts, maybe our language is getting in the way, because our language is very much subject-object oriented. We don't seem to worry about the verbs, the flowing movement. It's the flowing movement we were trying to get hold of. So then Bohm goes and invents a new language, the Rio mode. And then we were talking about that for some time. And I said, oi, Dave, it seems to me that what you're doing is you're taking this Rio mode and making nouns out of it. So we still were not thinking in terms of the Rio mode. And then he said, oh, well, maybe the problem is with our thought. Our thought is very mechanical. How can we become more creative? How can we do these things? This is where he was having these discussions with Krishnamurti. And then ultimately, it was the question of consciousness. So all of that, while I was trying to learn how to lecture physics to my group in Birkbeck College. So that background, it was lively. It was incredibly stimulating. And I think, Paul, congratulations. I think you've caught the spirit in your film. Your group, you and your group have really caught it. And I hope it's brought David Bohm alive to people so that they can actually, when they're reading some of his books, they've got your images to help them to see their way through. And also, could I say a thank you for Bruce Fetzer and the Fetzer Foundation? Because without them, this film would not have been made. And I'd like to say finally just one thing. I'd also like to thank them for the support that they are giving our experimental group at UCL. One of the problems is to try to show that with our new way of thinking that David was developing, are we going to lead to some new experiments that can be done in the laboratories to confirm that this new way of looking at the world is in the right directions? Already we had some very interesting results by Ephraim Steinberg and his people in Toronto, where he showed that some of these trajectories, these paths, whatever you want to call them, can actually be seen in the laboratory. He did it with light. We are in fact trying to investigate these trajectories in the interference situation using atoms. And here we have Rob Flack and Peter Barker and a couple of research students who are actually getting almost to the point where we have something new. It's always the same problem. We're almost there. And I think if we had not had the shutdown, I was hoping that we might be able to announce some new experimental results together with the launch of this film. So I thank them very much. And I thank you all out there for your interest in what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much, Basil. Fascinating. Wow, wonderful history. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience with David Bohm. And just to mention, you said the laboratory shut down. That was just temporarily due to the coronavirus, correct?
Yes, it shut down we were all herded out of the laboratories on the 11th of March, and we have not yet been allowed back in again.
Right.
But we're not being idle. We're not being idle. We've been thinking about new ways of doing the measurements, of more sensitive ways, simulating the effects on a computer, so that when we finally do get the key to the door, we can get in straight away and get on with it.
Excellent. I have a question for Paul. So in your work of the film and now reflecting back on it, what do you think is the most important point that you feel is lifted up from the film? What did you learn and what did you want others to take away? If you had to just pick one thing, what might that be? This is for Paul. Not hearing you, Paul? Don't have the sound. Okay, well, we'll come back to you, Paul. So we'll work on getting your sound working, and I'll ask another question. So this question can be for either Jan or Basil, whoever feels most comfortable to answer it. But can you share, we have a lot of questions coming in, by the way. I have way more here than we're going to have time to, so I'm going to try to lift just a few of them up. So if this one's for either Jan or Basil, can you share anything about the holographic theory of the universe and how Bohm's work connects?
Shall I take that, Jan?
Yeah, Basil, you go first on this.
Okay. Yes, that was a very interesting period in David's thinking through wholeness, because the hologram had actually come out as a new technique. And the interesting thing about the hologram, which David latched onto almost immediately, was the fact that when you're taking an ordinary film, if you cut the film in half, you lose half the image. But in the hologram, if you cut the thing in half, you still get the whole image, even though the image is not as sharp as it was. So that shows that the whole is actually enfolded in the image itself. And so Bohm's idea was to develop that. The hologram idea of Susskind is something different, but we did not go in that direction. We were just happy to use that as an analogy to illustrate what we were trying to do. I tell you someone who was interested in it, and that was Carl Pribram, who was a neuroscientist And he was very, very fascinated with that. And that's where David Bohm got interested in consciousness, where I got interested because Carl Pribram was actually doing experiments. But these were really very crude experiments for the time. Nowadays, experiments are much more sophisticated. So I hope that gives you some idea of the relation.
Thank you. Jan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, only that, watching the movie, I think the audience has seen, the major point was that the concept of wholeness that David Bohm sought to develop was based on movement, on process, on a state of becoming. And in the hologram, what you have, it's a state of being, right? Each part contains, each part of the whole again contains the whole. Now, when you apply this model to the enfolding and unfolding model of David Bohm, that would mean that you have events within events within events that each represent the totality of all events. So it's a more temporal model of becoming that David Bohm was after. But certainly the holographic image was a metaphor that probably really started that kind of thinking.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to do a little sound check with Paul. Paul, is your sound working?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Wonderful.
Good,
So I'm going to ask you a question, and you know what?
Okay.
I'm going to ask you a different question. Just going to throw you a curveball, just because there's so many questions that have come in. So, how did you become aware of David Bohm's work, and is there a personal story of yours behind this film?
Well, interestingly enough, I hadn't heard of David Bohm, in the way that I had heard about, we'll say, Einstein or Niels Bohr or Stephen Hawking. And, I grew up in a family where, our tea time discussions or our dinner discussions were very often about science and spirituality. And, I'd heard of Einstein. My father was very interested in physics. And he also had a spiritual dimension to him as well. But I'd never actually heard of David Bohm growing up. And it was actually only many years later when I was in Italy that I so happened to run into David Peat in a little cafe bar. And we were the only two people in the cafe bar, and we were noticeable by the fact that we were the only two that spoke English in this cafe bar in this little medieval village in Italy. So we got talking. Now, even at that first meeting, he hadn't discussed David Bohm with me. We had discussions about other things. I was very interested in the fact that he was from Liverpool. He had a very strong Liverpudlian accent, and no doubt he picked up on my Irish accent. And I was very curious about the fact that David Peat was older than me, and I kind of thought, well, maybe he was a contemporary of the Beatles, living in Liverpool. So I asked him that question. I said, did you know John Lennon and Paul McCartney? And he said, well, no, I didn't know them personally, but my father, who was an electrical contractor, had hired George Harrison as an apprentice electrician. And George Harrison had come in one afternoon and told David Peat's father that he was leaving to join this unknown band called the Beatles. And of course, the rest was history. So that was our first conversation. But it was only much later, getting to know Italy and getting to know that village, that I had several encounters with David Peat. And I learned that he was a physicist. He learned I was a filmmaker. And eventually, I think it was inevitable that David Bohm was going to come up in the conversation. So he he met me one day, and he said, would I be interested in looking at some a short treatment that he had written on David Bohm. And I said, yeah, absolutely. So I read these papers that he gave me, and I found them absolutely riveting. And I was immediately attracted more to the philosophical side of David Bohm's ideas. And because obviously not coming from a physics background myself, the physics would have been more difficult for me. But as I got more into it, I began to understand the basics of the physics behind the philosophy. And that's really, I guess, what was the seed, if you like, for the idea of infinite potential. And, I guess now we can say tonight that the rest is history.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. The next question is really for any of you, probably either Jan or Basil. What do you imagine David Bohm would say about the current reality with the global pandemic, the global reality regarding health and safety, and our increasing reliance on technology and its impact on our psyches? What do you think he would say about this moment in our history?
I plead. Oh, Susan, can I come in?
Go right ahead. You go first, Basil, please.
I think I almost plead the Fifth Amendment, because I don't think he would be very pleased with what is going on at the moment, either the pandemic or the political situation. He would be horrified.
But what about our ability right now to be all connected through technology? There's thousands of us sitting in this virtual space together. What might he say about that?
I've got to be careful here, because this interconnectedness can be very dangerous and it can be very beneficial. And we've seen lots of examples of where it can be very dangerous. The question would be, how do we get the interconnection to become useful for the whole of mankind and not for gain in various ways?
Yeah.
I don't think I want to go any further than that. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Basil. It's a really, really important point. Thank you. Jan, would you like to add something?
Yeah. I believe David Bohm did not witness, I think he died in October 1992, I believe. So this is more than 25 years ago. And so he did not witness the rise of the internet, our new digital world. And I think he would have, I personally believe, not knowing him, I think he would have expanded his mind to really understand. One thing's for sure, I think, in this, our consciousness is being changed in a way that is so extraordinary, even compared to when we were inventing books or radio or TV. But these were all sort of relatively passive interventions to the human mind via technology. Now, with this enormous interactivity, the degree of participation that's possible through these new technologies, and I have to think of David Bohm's idea about a participatory, observer-based universe, where there's constant interaction, flow of information back and forth. This is almost like what we're building now on the planet, is a digital network of information exchange that almost mirrors some of these ideas of David Bohm, that he had way before. But we are materializing them. And I don't know whether he would be horrified or whether he would be pleased. And we can't tell. But I think it's inevitable that we deal with this, that we start understanding how our consciousness is changed by these new means. And I think the Bohmian vision of an integrated worldview is a good tool and way forward to assess the state of the world today. Because one thing we are clearly aware of, and I think more and more people, including I think the audience tonight for this movie, the majority will be convinced that we need a new sense of togetherness, a new sense of relationality, a new sense of common experience of humanity as a whole in order to deal with these problems, and to actually, humanity might need to undergo a transformation in consciousness, in spirituality, if it wants to be able to deal with this technology in a positive way going forward, rather than being crushed by our technological possibilities. So in this way, I share Basil's skepticism, because we are on a threshold where we need to decide, is this going to be a horrible disaster for us, or is this going to be the way towards the future transformation of humanity? So that's it's a discussion we need to have in the next decades and years very heavily.
I would just like to comment a little bit on that too, because I think that David's sense of wholeness, I think, was in a way for me to come from within the individual, and the possibility of sensing wholeness yourself, sensing awareness, sensing consciousness, sensing your own being, if you like. You know, the new technology now that we're actually working with right now, it's wonderful that we can actually all connect with one another in this digital field. And I do think that David Bohm would have really embraced that. But in a sense, it's a kind of an impersonal kind of communication. I think I think David Bohm was trying to engender in people a sense of their own spirit, a sense of their own connection to the sources of production, a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And I think that first and foremost, certainly given the time that he lived in, I think that that's what he was trying to engender in people. He was trying to get a sense of their own sense of wholeness. And the possibility then that could be, if you like, translated, or it could be moved on to others. That once you feel whole yourself, you have the possibility perhaps of influencing others in that way. And so it is a different kind of interconnection that we're experiencing here. I mean, Jan is in Berlin and Basil is in the UK and I'm here in Dublin. And I think that is wonderful. And particularly during the global pandemic, our ability to actually communicate in this way is incredible. And I just wonder if we had a similar kind of pandemic, say 10, 15 years ago, you know, how we would have been able to communicate with one another. I think would have been. I don't think we would have got on top of the pandemic, on top of the pandemic, in the way we did without this kind of new technology. So you know, I think that I think Bohm's sense was that, you know, to engender that sense of belonging and to extend that into communities so that people would feel whole.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for your responses to that question. This question is for really any of you. Aside from meditation, how do we access this quantum field of potential? Perhaps, Jan, you could answer that, because the next question is going to go to Basil.
Well, I think if I look at David Bohm's radical idea of wholeness, I think I have a sense that I'm deeply connected with everything, not just around me, but even the things that I don't see. And I think just the very concept of non-locality, leading to fundamental interconnectedness as a possibility across the whole universe, might turn out to be proven in the next years or decades as a fundamental element of our existence. And it might be actually a kind of knowledge that we acquire, that this is so, and this will change how we likely interact with the world. I think meditation and having a sense of intuition about this sort of holistic existence is a start. But I think we can go way further than that. If I think down the road in the 21st century, there might be a possibility that we actually have proof of that kind of interconnectedness. And it would be wonderful to see how humanity would respond to such a situation. It's unpredictable, but I think it's possible.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan.
I would say that, you know, the two, and I'm just touching on what Jan is saying there. For me, I think the quantum potential is one of the most beautiful ideas in the film. The fact that you have this information potential that arises in the quantum domain, and that it is informing particles. And, you know, I think when you begin to realize that the entire physical universe is made up of particles, and that you have this potential, this informing potential, that conditions, if you like, the context of the particles, and informs them of that context, and that it is that information potential that allows the universe to be. I think that's such a beautiful idea. And then you have this idea of interconnectivity through non-locality that Jan mentioned, that particles at one end of the universe can communicate with particles at the other end of the universe instantaneously without any signal passing between them. I mean, that is an incredible idea. So I think if there are two ideas there, you've got the quantum potential and you've got these non-local interconnections. I mean, I think that in many ways is the huge gift, if you like, once proven, that Bohm gives to humanity, and all of the potentials that arise out of that.
Beautiful.
Susan,
Thank you,
can
Paul.
I come in? Susan, can I come in?
Absolutely, Basil, please.
Okay, well,
Go right ahead.
I'm facing the non-locality and the quantum potential in the small. I'm looking at it from the mathematics that I love dealing with, trying to see exactly what this means for us. So for me, it's more focusing on the small scale, on the quantum theory, on what exactly is this non-locality? What is this extra quality of energy that seems to be available when we go to quantum phenomena itself? An energy which disappears, sorry, let me get this clear. Energy is conserved, but somehow when we're in the interference regions, the energy becomes separated from the particles we're dealing with. And it's this extra energy that is organizing, that is the information field that Paul was talking about. But there's still a lot of work to be done in the mathematics, in the physics, before we can really extrapolate up to the macroscopic. The potential is there, but for me, it's trying to get much clearer on this actual what's going on in the physics, and we can try and have a look at that in the laboratory, and that is in fact what we're trying to do at University College London at the moment.
Thank you, Basil. The next question is actually for you as well. And you were with David the day he passed. And the last words, what we understand, at least what's shared in the film, is that he basically phoned his wife and he said, "I feel like I'm on the edge of something." What do What do you think that might have been?
I honestly don't know. I was asked by Sarah, and I was asked by David Beat's partner, Maureen, and I've been thinking about it. I just don't know. I remember the day very distinctly. We've been having a very energetic discussion, and it was coming up to about 6 o'clock, I think. And I said, David, I'm sorry, I've got to get home now. See you tomorrow. And he said, yeah, I'm not going home just yet. I want to sit quietly until the rush hour, because in London we have one hell of a rush hour, as you can imagine. So the next thing I heard was from Sarah saying, unfortunately, David's gone. So it was a shock and horror to me, because I'd left him feeling tired and he said he was all right. So I don't quite understand how that works. But anyway, so I don't know. I tried to recall what we were discussing at the time. It's now so long ago that even that memory has faded. And I honestly do not know what it was. But I do know that from my own experience, sometimes you can feel as if you're almost there. Whatever there is, you can feel something. You've been thinking about it, working on it. You can just see it, but it's just out of sight. And it could have been one of those. But I'm sorry, I cannot tell you exactly what it was.
Wow. Well, we will hold the question in that not knowing. We have one final question. This is a wonderful, rich panel, but I'm just aware of time. So this is a question that came in. Several people commented there was a photo in the film that was with a few dozen scientists posing for a photograph. And they were all men and one woman. Basil, you might have the answer. Who was the woman, and where was that photo taken?
Okay. Now, the problem was, I wish I could see the photo, but if it's the one I think it is, it was of the Solvay conference in 1911, and the only woman there was Madame Curie. So I think that was, and that the Solvay conferences were very famous in history at the beginning of the discovery of the quantum effects. And the Solvay conference of 1911 was just as things were beginning to hot up. And the Solvay conference, they were held in Brussels.
Thank you. That's great to know. So we still have about looks like 2,400 people are still watching, and I'm aware of the time. So just question: do I ask another question? Thumbs up. We end it. What do you think? I'll ask one more question. So, and I think you touched upon this in the film, but it would be really good at this moment in time. Was David Bohm ever accepted or acknowledged by the physics establishment, particularly in the United States, where he left?
Susan, can I answer that?
Sure.
Susan?
Please.
Okay. Yes. No. I've heard tales that he was ignored and neglected and so on. That's not true. Now let's do the UK first, which is what I'm very familiar with. He was actually elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. And you don't get elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society if your contemporaries hold you in as someone who shouldn't be in the group. So he was recognized by people and got through quite easily, I understand. In America, it depends who you talk to. I certainly know that people like John Wheeler had a very high regard for him. I know that personally because John Wheeler actually passed through 1 year in London, and he came in to see David, and David introduced me to him. And certainly there was great respect between John Wheeler and David Bohm. And in fact, the only thing that people were a bit skeptical about was his hidden variables. But if you talk to people about the implicate order and so on, physicists were generally very fascinated. What is he getting at? I remember a dispute that he was in with Professor Jauch, and I forget which university is in Geneva in Switzerland. And I was at a conference one day, and I'd sort of heard this rumblings about them having a really heated arguments. And I was at the breakfast table all by myself, so I like to get down early to have my breakfast. And who should walk in the room but Joseph Jauch himself? And I thought, oh goodness, I hope he doesn't come and sit next to me, because what am I going to say? Am I going to say I work with David Bohm or not and get a lambasting? So he came and sat there, and I said, oh, yeah, okay. And he then said, well, you know, what do you do? So I thought, okay, be a devil, BJ. I work with David Bohm. Oh, that's very interesting, he says. He's got such interesting ideas about the implicate order. Do you know anything about that? So I then started talking to him. He then said, oh, you must come and talk to my students in Geneva. So that is not someone who has no regard for David Bohm. And Joseph Jauch was a very eminent field theorist. So no, my impression was it depends who you talk to. The higher up you went, the more recognition he got.
Wonderful. Thank you, Basil.
Can I just make one point on that,
Sure.
Susan, please? I'd just like to ask Basil, what do you think the future is for David Bohm's ideas in terms of young students of physics now? Are his ideas being passed on, or you know, do you think that the establishment is still pretty stuck? And maybe I shouldn't even use the word establishment, because I think that physics and science has moved on hugely since the time that David Bohm was having his problems in the US, pre his exile in Brazil and so on. But these incredible ideas about the quantum potential and non-locality and interconnectivity and the implicate and explicate orders, is there an appetite, do you think, amongst the younger generation now to absorb these kind of ideas?
Yes, I certainly think so. I have noticed quite a change. And I think probably what's happened is, you see, the high energy physics has gone as far as it can. They're demanding bigger machines, even bigger machines. And we're getting to a state of affairs where people are beginning to worry a little bit about big science. And a lot of little science is being generated. And I think there is an appetite now. What do they say? When the old men die out, the youngsters take over, and a new generation with new questions, with new worries start to. I know I'm an old man myself, but I see amongst the youngsters I meet that there is this thirst, this enthusiasm for this new ideas. Not only because we've come a long way since when I started with David Bohm. There's so much new work that's out there which we can take hold of and dress these ideas in that mathematics. And that's what I'm hoping people will be interested in doing. And some of the students I've talked to really would like to get interested in this. So there is an appetite out there. I'm hopeful. In spite of my earlier pessimism about the internet, I'm hopeful that the youngsters will have the enthusiasm to carry these ideas and new ideas still, because this is not the final solution. It's a developing program. We still do not fully understand what this notion of wholeness and how it actually affects the laboratory, let alone general humanity.
And just one other comment,
Wonderful.
if you don't mind, and I throw this out to both Jan and to Basil. Bohm, as far as I understand it, didn't subscribe to the idea that there would ever be a theory of everything, that he saw an infinite quality in nature. And, I guess in simple terms, the more questions we ask and get answered will generate 1,000 new questions and 1,000,000 more answers. And it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. So he saw this infinite quality in nature. He didn't quite subscribe to the idea of a theory of everything. Would either of you have a comment on that?
Yes, could I please come in, Susan, again? I would have a comment on that. I think
Sure.
the theory of everything is really overstepping the mark, because what does that everything include? It doesn't include mind, it doesn't include consciousness, it doesn't include perception, it doesn't include biology. So it's a theory of what? That's my problem. The world out there is infinitely rich. There are many problems which we do not understand, and we need to work on them. To say the end of theoretical physics is in sight is stupid. I'm sorry. Lord Raleigh said that at the end of the last century, not this, 18th century, 17th, I don't know, somewhere way back there. He got up and said, I don't think people ought to go into theoretical physics. Around about 1900 this was. I don't think youngsters should go into theoretical physics because it's all tied up. Of course, there are two little dark clouds on the horizon, he said, and those dark clouds gave us relativity and quantum mechanics. So you never know which dark cloud is going to blow up. And there are many dark clouds around in physics.
Thank you, Basil. Jan, I will give you the opportunity to have the last word here. Response to that question? Additional thoughts?
I just could add, also when we, in the movie, there was this very puzzling line by David Bohm, when he was sitting next to the Dalai Lama saying, the science that we have today, it's a contingent fact that science is based on measurement. Remember, David Bohm had really a very radical notion of what even science is. And I think this question about the end of science, a theory of everything, is really tied up with that. Science itself might change into something completely new. Then all the rules we know about what a theory of everything might be will change with it. And I think just like we had the modern scientific revolution, with Galileo, Newton, Descartes, 400 years ago. And then we had the quantum and the relativity revolution, early in the 20th century. Who knows what the next revolution might be? We don't even know where we might be in 2050, halfway through the 21st century. Our whole notion of what scientific explanation is might change. It might all become informational, virtual. Already we are losing concept of reality in favor of information. On and on and on. And so I think this raises the question of what kind of science will we see in the future. And science will always change again. Science is not a monolith that is eternal. Science will always be evolving. And in the future, we might have a holistic science, a relational science, with completely new dimensions of scientific knowledge. That would be my last word.
Wonderful. Well, that was perfect ending. What a wonderful panel. My deep appreciation to each of the panelists, Dr. Jan Walleczek, Professor Basil Hiley, filmmaker Paul Howard, and all of you for sticking with us and for watching the film and participating in the panel. Thank you so much for your great questions. So this film is available freely. It's available to the world. It's a gift from the Fetzer Memorial Trust. So please go to infinitepotential.com, share it with your friends. It is there for anyone and everyone. And please join us again on July 5th or 6th, depending on what time zone you're in. There's going to be another panel discussion with esteemed Buddhist scholars, and that is going to happen on the Dalai Lama's 85th birthday. So we hope you can join us for that as well. So just wishing everyone good health, keep safe, and may we never forget that we are together, interconnected on this planet. Just wishing you all well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.